While chasing down rent, a millionaire finds this little girl, his long-lost daughter, working like a slave. But what he discovered that day will shock you. Comment what you think will happen. Your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. Your help is very important. The scorching sun beat down on the streets of downtown Phoenix when Theodore Vance parked his Land Rover in front of the faded yellow two-story house on Palm Tree Lane. At 58, the most influential businessman in Arizona rarely collected rent in person, but something about this situation bothered him. 3 months of overdue rent from the Mendoncas wasn't typical, especially for one of his more modest properties. Straightening his Italian silk tie, Theodore got out of the car and eyed the poorly maintained facade. He knocked on the door 3 times before hearing shuffling footsteps from inside. A tiny girl, no older than 6, struggled to open the door. She was wearing a tattered dress 2 sizes too big, her black hair was disheveled, and she was barefoot. "Good afternoon, mister," she said in a timid voice, barely able to look up at him. Theodore felt a pang in his chest. Something was very wrong here. The smell of cleaning products was strong, and the girl's small hands were red and chapped. "Hello, little one. Are your parents home?" he asked, trying to keep his voice gentle so as not to scare her. "Mrs. Monroe is watching her stories," the girl replied, pointing inside the house. Before Theodore could process why she referred to the woman as Mrs. Monroe instead of Mom, a shrill voice cut through the air. "Isis, who told you to open the door? Get back to the kitchen right now. There are dishes to wash." Malus Monroe appeared at the door, her round face contorted in irritation that quickly turned into a forced smile as she recognized the visitor. "Mr. Vance, what a surprise!" "Mrs. Monroe," Theodore interrupted her dryly, his eyes fixed on little Isis, who shrank with each word. "Could you please explain to me why a child this age is washing dishes and answering the door alone?" "Oh, you know how it is. We're teaching her responsibility early," Malus tried to explain nervously. "Her mum asked us to look after her. Oh, she works a lot, you know." At that moment, a man stumbled through the living room, smelling of alcohol, even at that hour of the afternoon. Jefferson Monroe, 47, held a crumpled lottery ticket in his hands. "Who's there, Malus?" he asked, his voice slurred. "It's Mr. Vance, Jeff. He came for a visit," Malus replied quickly. Theodore watched the scene with growing indignation. The living room was spotless, but through the kitchen door he could see Isis precariously balanced on a stool, trying to reach the high sink. "Mrs. Monroe," he said with a calmness he didn't feel, "I'd like you to explain to me exactly what the situation is with this child, now." While Malus stammered inconsistent explanations, Theodore pulled his cell phone from his pocket and began to discreetly photograph the environment. His blood boiled as he saw the calluses on Isis's small hands, the deep, dark circles under her, childish face, and the way she moved around the house like a little maid. The scene instantly transported him back to his own childhood, not the one everyone knew of the wealthy Theodore Vance, but the true one of Jimmy Silver, the boy who grew up in poverty before, at 36, assuming his boss's identity after a tragic accident. A fraud that had haunted him for 22 years, but now seemed insignificant compared to the suffering of that child. "Where is her mother?" he demanded to know, interrupting Malus's excuses. "Valentina? She hasn't been around for a while," Jefferson replied, shrugging. "Said she was going to work 3 different jobs to save money. But who knows? Irresponsible woman." Theodore clenched his fists, painfully remembering Olivia, his biological daughter, whom he hadn't seen in 22 years, since the divorce that preceded his identity change. How many other children suffered like that, separated from their mothers, by cruel circumstances? "Call the girl here," he ordered. Malus hesitated. "But Mr. Vance—" "Now." His voice allowed no argument. Isis came to the living room, wiping her hands on her oversized dress. Her dark, scared eyes reminded Theodore so much of Olivia at the same age that he felt his throat tighten. Isis, he knelt to be at her level. Would you like to leave here, to live in a place where you don't have to work? The girl's eyes widened, a flash of hope quickly replaced by fear. She glanced quickly at Marluce, who had her lips pressed into a thin line. You can't take her, Mr. Vance, Jefferson interjected. We have an agreement with her mother. An agreement? Theodore stood up, his voice sharp. I'm sure the authorities would be very interested to know what kind of agreement that is, Mr. Monroe, just as they would be interested to know why you are using child labor. The couple paled. Theodore knew he was playing dangerously. After all, any deeper investigation into his life could reveal his own fraud, but looking at Isis, so small and scared, he knew he had no choice. Let's make a deal, he proposed, his voice low and menacing. You give me temporary guardianship of the girl, and I not only forget about the overdue rent, but also don't expose this degrading situation. In exchange, you tell me everything you know about Valentina Fontes. As the Monroe couple exchanged nervous glances, Theodore felt the weight of his decision. He was about to bring a child into his home, where his current wife, Deborah, obsessed with status, certainly wouldn't welcome her, where every new, curious glance could unravel his deepest secret, where his housekeeper, Anastasia, the only one who knew his true identity, would certainly question him. But feeling Isis's small hand reaching for his, he knew there was no turning. And back! That child needed him, just as he once needed help and didn't find it. If that meant risking everything he had built in the last 22 years, so be it. What Theodore didn't know was that his decision that scorching afternoon in Phoenix would unleash a series of events that would bring long-buried secrets to light, connecting past and present in ways that no one could have foreseen. When Theodore opened the door of the Vance mansion carrying Isis in his arms, the first person he met was Anastasia Lima, the 52-year-old housekeeper who had guarded his biggest secret for decades, dropped the duster she was holding at the unusual scene. Goodness gracious, Mr. Vance, who is this child? Anastasia asked, approaching with concern as she noticed the child's poor condition. Before he could answer, the sound of heels against the marble floor echoed through the entrance hall. Deborah Vance, 39, came down the main staircase with her usual studied elegance, but she stopped abruptly when she saw the scene. What does this mean, Theodore? Her voice cut through the air like a razor. Isis shrank in Theodore's arms, hiding, her face in his expensive suit jacket. He could feel the tremor of her small body, and that only strengthened his resolve. Deborah, Anastasia, this is Isis. She's going to stay with us for a while, he announced with the same authority he used in his business meetings. Anastasia, please prepare the guest room on the second floor, the one with the garden view, and get her a hot bath and clean clothes. Have you lost your mind? Deborah advanced, her eyes flashing. You can't just bring any child into our house. What will people think, and why is she so dirty? Theodore finished coldly. Because she was being exploited, used as a domestic worker at 6 years old. By our tenants, no less. Deborah paled slightly, but quickly composed herself. Still, there are appropriate agencies to deal with this kind of situation. It's not our responsibility. It is, Theodore interrupted her. It's my responsibility as a human being, and now it's yours too, as my wife. As the couple stared at each other in a silent standoff, Anastasia gently took Isis from Theodore's arms. The girl resisted initially, but something in the housekeeper's warm smile reassured her. Come with me, little one, Anastasia whispered. Let's get you all clean and comfortable. As soon as they were alone, Deborah exploded. You can't do this to me, Theodore. Isn't it enough work to maintain our social position in this provincial town? Now you want me to be seen as some kind of benefactor of street children. Lower your voice, Theodore ordered, pulling her into his office. He closed the door and poured himself a shot of whiskey before continuing. "You don't understand, Deborah. This girl, she reminded me of things that—" He stopped abruptly. He had almost made the mistake of talking about his true childhood, about the privations he had suffered as Jimmy Silver. Deborah only knew him as Theodore Vance, the well-born businessman who had transformed his father's furniture store chain into an empire. "What things?" Deborah asked, perceptive as always. "Of Olivia," he lied, using his biological daughter as a shield. "You know I haven't seen her in 22 years. This girl is almost the same age she was when—" "Oh, please!" Deborah threw her hands up in the air. "Don't come with that cheap sentimentalism. You've never cared that much about Olivia. You barely talk about her." If she only knew, Theodore thought bitterly, if she knew that he barely talked about his daughter because every mention of her reminded him of the life he had abandoned, the identity he had stolen, the man he once was. "The decision is made," he declared. "Isis stays, at least until we find her mother." "And how long will that take?" Deborah crossed her arms. "As long as it takes." At that moment they heard a commotion coming from upstairs. Theodore ran up the stairs, followed by a displeased Deborah. In the guest suite bathroom, they found Anastasia trying to calm Isis, who was crying copiously. "What happened?" Theodore asked, alarmed. "The hot water, sir," Anastasia explained with teary eyes. "She's never had a hot bath before. She was scared by the steam." Theodore felt his heart clench. He approached the bathtub, where Isis was now gradually calming down, fascinated by the soap bubbles that Anastasia was making to distract her. "Look at this, little one," the housekeeper smiled, blowing more bubbles. "Isn't it magical?" It was then that Anastasia noticed something that made her freeze. On Isis's nape, partially covered by her dark hair, was a small, crescent-shaped birthmark. Exactly like the one Jimmy Silver's mother, the real Jimmy, who was now posing as Theodore, had. Her eyes met her boss's, who had also noticed the mark. For a moment time seemed to stop. This couldn't be a coincidence. But how? "Theodore," Deborah's voice cut through the moment. "We need to talk about how we're going to explain this." To Esther, his daughter with Deborah, 25, an international model living in Paris. Or at least that's what everyone thought. What no one knew was that she had abandoned her career after a scandal that the family had hushed up at great expense. And now, as Deborah reminded him with a malicious smile, she was coming home. "She arrives tomorrow," Deborah continued, "and knowing our daughter, she won't easily accept your sudden vocation for charity." Theodore barely heard her. His eyes were fixed on Isis, who was now playing timidly with a rubber duck that Anastasia had found. How could that child have the same birthmark as his mother, his real mother, not the man whose identity he had stolen? "Anastasia," he called, "as soon as you're done here, come to my office. We need to talk." The housekeeper nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. In 22 years of guarding Theodore's secret, or rather Jimmy's, she had never seen her boss so shaken. Meanwhile, Isis watched everything with her big, dark eyes, absorbing every detail of that new world in which she found herself. The luxury of the bathroom, bigger than the entire room where she slept at the Monroe's house. Anastasia's kindness, so different from Marluce's screams. And especially the imposing presence of Theodore, who looked at her in a way that no one had ever looked at her before. What none of them knew was that at that very moment, a mysterious figure was watching the mansion from across the street. Orlando Menzies, 52, a former partner of the real Theodore Vance, clutched in his hands an envelope with documents that could destroy the empire built on a stolen identity. Beside him, in the passenger seat, was a tattered diary he had bought from Marluce Monroe hours earlier. The diary of Valentina Fontes, Isis's mother, containing secrets that connected all those lives in unimaginable ways. Finally, my dear Theodore, or should I say Jimmy, Orlando murmured to himself, a cruel smile forming on his lips. Finally, you made a mistake. Night fell in Phoenix when Anastasia finally entered Theodore's office. The room, paneled with dark wood and books that had never been opened, held more secrets than the entire mansion. It was there, 22 years ago, that she found a desperate Jimmy Silver, covered in the blood of the real Theodore Vance, begging for her help after the accident. "Sit down, Anastasia." Theodore indicated the leather armchair in front of his massive desk. His hands trembled slightly as he poured 2 shots of cognac. "How is the girl?" "Sleeping like an angel," the housekeeper replied, accepting the drink. "She cried a little, calling for her mother, but she fell asleep after I told her a story. She'd never heard a fairy tale before. Imagine that." Theodore closed his eyes, feeling the weight of his decisions. "The birthmark." "The same as Mrs. Matilda's," Anastasia completed, referring to the real Jimmy's mother. "I'll never forget that mark. When I took care of her in her last days, before everything happened, she always said it was a blessing from heaven." Silence weighed between them, laden with memories and guilt. Theodore stood up, walking to the window overlooking the illuminated garden. Down there, the roses that Deborah insisted on keeping, even in Phoenix's harsh climate, struggled to survive. "We need to find Valentina," he said finally. "The Monroes gave me 3 addresses where she supposedly works as a cleaning lady. I want you to investigate discreetly, Anastasia. You have your contacts in town, people who trust you." "And what about Mrs. Vance? She's not going to make things easy." Theodore laughed humorlessly. "Deborah is the least of my problems now. Esther comes back tomorrow." Anastasia paled. "Did the girl really give up her career in Paris?" "Apparently. Deborah mentioned something about a scandal, but she didn't go into details." He paused thoughtfully. "Esther has always been too observant for my liking. And now, with Isis here..." A noise from the hallway interrupted them. When Theodore opened the door, he found only silence. But he was sure he had heard footsteps. Upstairs, Deborah quietly closed her bedroom door, her heart racing. She had heard enough to confirm her suspicions of years. Her husband was hiding a devastating secret. And now, with Esther's return and the mysterious arrival of this child, it was her chance to discover the truth. She picked up her cell phone and typed a message. "We need to talk. Tomorrow. Same place." Across town in a modest apartment, Orlando. Menzies smiled as he read Deborah's message. He opened Valentina's diary again, his eyes scanning the yellowed pages eagerly. The woman's confused notes, fragments of memories of her childhood before the adoption, were like pieces of a macabre puzzle. "March 16th, 1999, he read in a low voice. "I dreamed about the accident again, the sound of metal twisting, the screams, the smell of gasoline. But this time I saw something different. A man pulling me from the burning car, wrapping me in his expensive jacket. He had a gold badge on his chest, like the ones bank guards wear." Orlando closed the diary, his hands trembling with excitement. The guard who saved Valentina as a baby from the accident worked at the same bank as Jimmy Silver before he assumed Theodore's identity. The connections were starting to make sense. At the mansion, Isis tossed and turned in her sleep. In her dreams, she was trapped in a burning car, but it wasn't her. It was as if she were observing through someone else's eyes. A woman was crying, a man was screaming, and then everything went dark. When she woke up, startled, she found Anastasia, sitting beside her, stroking her hair. "Calm down, little one," the housekeeper whispered. "It was just a nightmare." "Aunt Anastasia," Isis murmured, still trembling. Why do I dream about things that never happen to me? The innocent question made Anastasia freeze. She carefully observed the girl's face, looking for and finding familiar features that she hadn't noticed before. The shape of the eyes, identical to Matilda Silver's. The delicate chin, like that of the young woman who died in the accident along with her baby so many years ago. The next morning, the mansion was awakened by the sound of an insistent horn. A yellow cab pulled up in front of the main gate, and Esther Vance got out. Her blonde hair, once long and perfectly styled for the runways of Paris, was now cut shoulder-length. Deep dark circles marked her face, normally immaculate for magazine photos. "Miss Esther," Anastasia rushed to help her with her bags. "We weren't expecting you so early." "Change of plans?" Esther replied dryly, her eyes scanning the facade. "Of the house, as if looking for changes." "Where's my father?" "In the office, as always," replied the housekeeper, noticing the tremor in the young woman's hands as she grabbed her purse. Esther stormed through the entrance hall, ignoring her mother's calls from downstairs. She opened the office door without knocking, finding Theodore on the phone. "I don't care how much it costs. I want all the information about Valentina. Fontes in the last 24 hours, he was saying, but he stopped when he saw his daughter. "I'll call you later." "Esther," he stood up, arms open for a hug that didn't come. What a pleasant surprise. "Surprise?" She laughed humorlessly, throwing a French magazine on his desk. "More surprising than this." On the cover, a sensational headline, "Brazilian top model Esther Vance involved in drug scandal at private party. Family hushes up case with multi-million dollar bribe. Daughter, I can explain." "Explain what? How you bribed the French police to cover up the case? How you paid the clinic to falsify my tests?" Esther trembled. "Or are you going to explain why there's a strange child sleeping in the guest room?" Before Theodore could answer, they heard a scream coming from upstairs. It was Isis in the middle of another nightmare. Without thinking, he ran to her aid, leaving Esther alone in the office. The young woman looked around, her model-trained eyes capturing details that most would ignore. The picture frame turned upside down on the shelf, the half-open drawer of the desk, and above all, the tension in the air, thick as the fog that covered Phoenix in the winter mornings. She approached the ajar drawer, her heart racing. Inside, she found an old folder yellowed with age, and when she opened it, her breath caught. It was an identity card. In the photo, a man incredibly similar to her father, but not exactly the same. The name on the document, Jimmy Silver. Upstairs, Theodore was hugging Isis, who was sobbing after another vivid nightmare about the accident she had never lived through. Anastasia watched them from the door, her mind connecting dots that she preferred not to connect. And on the outskirts of the city, a black car stopped in front of a rundown diner. Outside, an exhausted woman in a cleaning uniform was serving tables. Valentina Fontes looked up when she heard the car, and her face lost all color as she recognized the driver. "Don't get near your daughter," Orlando said through the open window, "or everyone will find out who really died in that accident 22 years ago." The Good Taste Diner on the outskirts of Phoenix was the kind of establishment that people frequented out of necessity, not choice. The smell of old frying oil permeated the air, mixing with the odor of reheated coffee and cheap disinfectant. Valentina Fontes, 28, balanced 3 plates as she tried to ignore the menacing presence of Orlando Menzies, who occupied a table in the darkest corner of the place. "More coffee, sir?" she asked an elderly customer, her hands trembling slightly as she held the thermal carafe. "Don't try to stall, Valentina," Orlando's voice cut through the air. "Sit down, now." With resignation, she took the seat across from him, still wearing the rumpled uniform from her first job of the day, cleaning lady at the municipal hospital. Her deep, dark circles betrayed the sleepless nights, the overtime, the 3 jobs that barely paid her bills. "How's my daughter?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "Your daughter?" Orlando laughed humorlessly. Interesting you should mention that. Do you know she's at the Vance mansion now? Our friend Theodore, or should I say Jimmy, took her. And from the Monroes yesterday. Valentina's face paled even more. He can't. I need to. You don't need to do anything, Orlando cut her off, pushing her diary across the greasy table. Except explain some interesting things I found here. For example, these recurring dreams of yours about a car accident. Curious how they started exactly when you were adopted, isn't it? Valentina stared at the diary as if it were a snake about to strike. How did you get this? Let's just say the Monroes were very helpful after they found out how much I was willing to pay for information about you. He flipped through the yellowed pages. But the most interesting thing isn't your dreams, Valentina. It's this. He pointed to a specific page where she had drawn, in a moment of reverie, a crescent-shaped birthmark, the same mark that her daughter Isis carried on the nape of her neck. Why is this important? She asked, genuinely confused. Because that specific mark, Orlando smiled maliciously, was the trademark of the Vance family. The real Vance family, not the farce that Jimmy Silver built. At the Vance mansion, Esther reread for the 10th time the documents she had found in her father's office drawer. Her head spun with the implications: Jimmy Silver's identity card, newspaper clippings about a car accident that killed the real Theodore Vance, and more disturbing, an old birth certificate with the name of her supposed half-sister, Olivia Silver. "Who are you, really?" she murmured to herself, staring at the faded photo of Jimmy. The resemblance to her father was uncanny, but now that she knew what to look for, the differences were evident. The slightly different shape of the nose, the almost imperceptible scar above the right eyebrow. A child's scream tore her from her thoughts. It came from the room where the mysterious girl was staying. Driven by curiosity, Esther quietly approached the ajar door. Inside the room, Anastasia was trying to calm Isis, who was thrashing in bed, trapped in another nightmare. "The car! It's on fire!" the girl screamed, her small hands gripping the sheets. "Mommy! Daddy!" "Shh, little one," Anastasia hugged her. "It was just a dream. You're safe here." Esther watched the scene with a mixture of fascination and horror. How could a child who, according to her father, came from a poor family dream so vividly about a car accident? Unless... "Miss Esther?" Anastasia's voice startled her. The housekeeper was staring at her from the door, her eyes revealing a mixture of fear and resignation. "I think we need to talk." Meanwhile, in the office, Theodore was facing his own crisis. Deborah stood before him, her normally placid face contorted into a mask of controlled fury. "How long did you think you could keep up this charade, darling?" she asked, throwing old photos of the real Theodore Vance on his desk. "Do you know how long I've suspected? Since you forgot the name of the dog you supposedly had as a child, since you didn't recognize your own mother when she appeared in that old photo." "Deborah," he began, but she interrupted him. "No, now you're going to listen to me. I kept your secret all these years because we built something together, because you gave me status, money, social position, but now..." She laughed bitterly. "Now you bring any child into our house, risking exposing everything for what? For guilt? For remorse?" "She's not just any child," Theodore replied, his voice low but firm. "There's something about her, something I can't explain." "Oh, please," Deborah exploded, "don't give me that story of a special connection. You're not the real Theodore Vance. You have no right to the name, the fortune, to any of this." "And you think I don't know that?" He stood up, his voice thundering. "Do you think I haven't carried this weight for 22 years? That I don't torture myself thinking about my real daughter, Olivia, whom I abandoned to live this lie?" The sound of something falling made them turn around. Esther was standing at the door, a broken coffee cup at her feet, her eyes wide with shock. "Esther!" Theodore took a step towards her, but she recoiled. "Don't come near me!" Her voice trembled. You're not my father." The silence that followed was deafening. It was broken only by the sound of hurried footsteps in the hallway, Anastasia carrying a sleeping Isis. "Sir," the housekeeper was breathless. She had another nightmare, but this time she described the accident in detail, the same accident that killed the real Theodore Vance. The revelation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Deborah staggered, leaning on the desk. Esther slid down the wall to the floor, her legs unable to support her. And Theodore just watched the sleeping face of Isis, where familiar features were beginning to make a terrible sense. Outside, the mansion, a car parked silently. Orlando Menzies got out of the vehicle, followed by a visibly disturbed Valentina. In her hands, the diary that held the key to the whole mystery. "Let's pay our friend Theodore a visit," Orlando smiled cruelly. "It's time for all the masks to fall." At the guardhouse, the night security guard consulted the list of authorized visitors and frowned when he saw a name that hadn't been updated in decades: Olegario Vance, brother of the deceased Theodore. "Do you have an appointment?" he asked the grey-haired man driving the third car to arrive at the mansion in the last few minutes. "I don't need an appointment to visit my late brother's house," replied Olegario, his eyes fixed on the illuminated window of the office. "Especially when I've discovered that an imposter has been using his name for more than 20 years. The storm brewing in the Phoenix sky was just a prelude to what was to come. In a matter of minutes, all the lies, all the false identities, all the secrets carefully guarded for decades were about to come to light. And at the center of it all, a little 6-year-old girl whose nightmares carried the memories of a past she never lived, but which was about to transform the future of everyone around her. The storm brewing over Phoenix seemed to mirror the chaos that was about to take hold in the Vance mansion. The first raindrops drummed on the office windows, where time seemed to have frozen after the revelations of the last few minutes. Esther was still sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, as she tried to process the truth about the man she thought was her father. Deborah maintained her rigid posture, but her fingers drummed nervously on the mahogany desk, betraying her anxiety. Anastasia held sleeping Isis as if the girl were a talisman against the approaching storm, both literal and metaphorical. And Theodore, no, Jimmy, stood before the window, watching 3 different cars approach the mansion through the main gate. His face, normally a mask of control and authority, now revealed every one of his 58 years and the weight of 2 decades of lies. "Sir," the guard at the gate called on the intercom, we have visitors." "Who?" Theodore asked, though he already knew the answer. "Orlando Menzies, sir. And—" The guard hesitated. "Olegario Vance." The name fell like a bomb in the office. Deborah let out a small gasp of surprise. Esther raised her head sharply, recognizing the name of her supposed uncle, who everyone believed to have been abroad for decades. "And there's one more person," the guard continued, "a woman named Valentina Fontes." It was Anastasia's turn to react, unconsciously clutching Isis tighter to her chest. The girl stirred in her sleep, murmuring something about fire and screams. "Let them in," Theodore ordered, his voice surprisingly firm. "And call Regina from the kitchen. Ask her to take Isis to her room and stay there." Anastasia reluctantly handed the sleeping girl over to the cook, who appeared seconds later. As soon as Regina left with Isis, Theodore turned to face his shattered family. "You deserve to know the whole truth," he said, "before others tell their version of it." "How generous of you," Deborah commented sarcastically, "after 22 years of lies. 22 years in which you lived very well with my lies, didn't you, darling?" he retorted, making her blush. "Stop!" Esther stood up, her voice trembling but determined. "I want to know everything, from the beginning." Theodore, Jimmy, nodded slowly, but before he could begin, the office door opened. Orlando Menzies entered first, his predatory smile illuminated by a flash of lightning. Right behind him, Valentina Fontes, looking even smaller in her cleaning uniform, her eyes immediately searching for ISIS. And lastly, Olegario Vance, the spitting image of his deceased brother, his eyes fixed on the man who had stolen Theodore's identity. "What a touching family reunion," Orlando commented, closing the door behind him. "Or should I say, what a meeting of strangers united by lies." "Orlando," Theodore greeted him coldly. "Still bitter about losing control of Vance Enterprises 22 years ago." "I lost to an imposter," Orlando snarled, "to a bank security guard who was lucky enough to look like Theodore and cruel enough to take advantage of an accident to steal his life." "It wasn't quite like that," Anastasia interjected, surprising everyone. "I was there. I saw everything." "Then tell us." Olegario spoke for the first time, his voice carrying the weight of the true Vance authority. "Tell us how my brother really died." Anastasia looked at Theodore, who nodded slightly. She took a deep breath and began, "It was a night like this, with a storm. I had worked for the Vances for years, and that night, the real Theodore had scheduled an important meeting with Jimmy Silver, who was head of security at the bank where the companies had their accounts. Theodore suspected embezzlement. He thought Orlando was stealing. "Lies!" Orlando interrupted, but Olegario silenced him with a gesture. "Continue," he ordered. "Jimmy had proof," Anastasia continued. "Documents showing how Orlando had been siphoning money for years. They arranged the meeting on Old Route 66, away from everyone's eyes. I was in the car with Theodore because he needed a witness. Jimmy was following in another vehicle." She stopped, her hands trembling as she recalled. It all happened so fast. A car came out of nowhere at high speed. It hit Jimmy's vehicle first, which rolled several times. Then it came towards us. "The black car," Valentina murmured suddenly, her face pale. "In my dreams, there's always a black car." Everyone turned to her, confused, but Anastasia continued. "Our car also rolled. Theodore, the real Theodore, didn't make it. I managed to get out, but when I tried to help Jimmy in his car, we saw that the other vehicle was on fire. There was a family inside." "My family," Olegario interrupted, his voice laden with emotion. "My wife Olga and our newborn daughter. I spent 22 years believing that everyone had died that night. But they didn't, did they?" Orlando smiled maliciously, picking up Valentina's diary. "Because this diary tells a very interesting story about a baby rescued from a burning car by a man with a security badge." Valentina staggered, leaning against the wall. Her eyes met Theodore Jimmy's, widened in comprehension. You saved me," she whispered. "And then assumed my brother's identity," Olegario completed, "leaving me to believe that I had lost my entire family." "It wasn't like that," Theodore protested. "I saved the baby, yes. I handed her over to a couple who were passing by on the road, who promised to take care of her. But Orlando had planned everything. The accident, the ambush." "Prove it," Orlando challenged. "The documents," Theodore replied, walking to his safe. "The same ones I was going to give Theodore that night. I kept them all these years, waiting for the right moment. But when he opened the safe, it was empty." "Looking for this?" Deborah smiled, pulling an old folder from her designer purse. "I'm not as naive as you think, darling. I always knew you kept something important here." A particularly loud thunderclap shook the windows, and at the same instant, a child's scream echoed through the mansion. It was Isis, in the middle of another nightmare. "Mommy!" The girl's voice came muffled. "The car is on fire. The man with the gold badge is coming to help us." The blood drained from everyone's face. Valentina was the first to move, running towards her daughter's voice. The others followed, leaving only Theodore and Olegario in the office. "You saved my daughter," Olegario said finally, "and then stole my brother's life." "I saved your daughter," Theodore agreed, "and I spent 22 years trying to fix the damage Orlando had done to Vance Enterprises, not for me, but for her, because I knew that one day the truth would come to light." In Isis's room, Valentina hugged her daughter, who was trembling after another vivid nightmare. The crescent-shaped birthmark on the girl's nape glowed under the lightning flashes, identical to the one Valentina had discovered on her own back after reading her diary. The storm continued to rage over Phoenix, but inside the Vance mansion, decades of secrets were finally beginning to unravel, and at the center of it all, a little girl whose dreams carried the memories of a past that connected all those present in ways that no one could have imagined. The early morning hours crept over Phoenix, but no one in the Vance mansion thought of sleeping. The storm had subsided into a persistent drizzle, which beat monotonously against the windows of the room where Isis finally rested in Valentina's arms. The small living room adjacent to the bedroom had transformed into an improvised war room, where the truths and lies of 2 decades were being unearthed. Esther watched the scene with the critical eyes of someone who had spent years walking the most demanding runways in Paris. Her father, no, she corrected herself mentally, Jimmy, was sitting in a leather armchair, looking like he had aged 10 years in the last few hours. Olegario occupied the opposite position, his fingers drumming on the arm of the chair in a nervous rhythm. Orlando remained standing, restless as a caged predator, while Deborah methodically flipped through the documents she had stolen from the safe. "So you not only assumed Theodore's identity," Esther broke the silence, her voice controlled, "but you also hid the survival of a child from her own family?" "It wasn't that simple," Jimmy replied, running a hand over his tired face. "That night, when I pulled Valentina from the burning car, Orlando was already there. He saw everything." "It's true," Orlando admitted, surprising everyone. "I had been following Theodore for weeks, waiting for an opportunity to prevent him from exposing my financial irregularities." "Irregularities?" Anastasia laughed bitterly from the doorway, where she maintained her vigil. "You were embezzling millions, destroying the company that Theodore's father took decades to build, and you decided to cause an accident to prevent the denunciation?" Olegario stood up, his voice trembling with contained fury. "You killed my brother, my wife." "No!" Orlando recoiled. "The accident wasn't supposed to happen like that. I just wanted to force Theodore to stop, to get the documents. I didn't know his family was on the road too." "But they were," Jimmy interjected. "And when I saw their car on fire, I didn't think twice. The documents that proved Orlando's crimes could wait. A life couldn't." Deborah, who had been maintaining a calculated silence, looked up from the papers. "But why assume Theodore's identity? Why not simply save the child and report everything?" "Because he saw me," Valentina answered from the bedroom door, her voice low but firm. During the conversation, she had put Isis to sleep and now joined the group. "In my dreams, in my diaries, I always knew there was a man with a gold badge. He saved me, gave me to a couple who were passing by, but Orlando saw everything. And I used that as leverage," Orlando completed, a humorless smile on his lips. "When I realized that Jimmy was practically identical to Theodore, I saw an opportunity. He would take Theodore's place, maintain my position in the company, and in return, I wouldn't reveal that Olegario's daughter was alive." "A perfect blackmail," Esther murmured, the pieces falling into place. "The man who saved the baby assumes Theodore's identity, keeps the business running, and Orlando continues with his embezzlement." "But that's not what happened, was it?" Anastasia stepped forward. "Because Jimmy had other plans." Jimmy nodded slowly. I had grown up in poverty, seen my mother wither away working 3 jobs, like Valentina does today. When I assumed Theodore's identity, I swore I would use that power for something greater. And that's what he did, Anastasia continued. Little by little, he pushed Orlando away, recovering the embezzled money, transforming Vance Enterprises into the empire it is today. But he always kept the documents that proved everything, waiting for the right moment. The right moment for what? Deborah asked, but her tone suggested that she already knew the answer. To return everything to the true heirs, Jimmy replied, looking directly at Olegario, to your daughter Valentina, and now to your granddaughter Isis. A heavy silence fell over the room. It was broken by the soft sound of footsteps. Isis, who had woken up and now stood in the bedroom doorway, rubbing her sleepy eyes. I had another dream, she said, her childish voice carrying a maturity incompatible with her 6 years. But this time it wasn't scary. It was about a golden angel pulling me from the fire and giving me to my other parents. Valentina sobbed quietly, pulling her daughter into her lap. Olegario watched the scene with unshed tears in his eyes, seeing in Isis the unmistakable features of his deceased wife, Olga. Her dreams, Esther spoke thoughtfully. They're not just dreams, are they? No, confirmed a new voice from the doorway. Dr. Michael Santos, a neurologist from the hospital where Valentina worked as a cleaning lady, entered the room. He had been called discreetly by Anastasia hours earlier, when Isis's nightmares began to intensify. There is a rare condition, the doctor explained, called traumatic genetic memory. In cases of severe trauma involving pregnant women or very young babies, memories can be imprinted on DNA, manifesting generations later through unexplained dreams or sensations. So Isis isn't just dreaming about the accident, Valentina understood, stroking her daughter's hair. She is reliving my memories of that night. Precisely, the doctor agreed, and this condition, well, it is particularly common in families with certain distinct genetic characteristics, such as, for example, a hereditary birthmark. All eyes turned to the small crescent-shaped mark on Isis's nape, identical to Valentina's, identical to the one Olga Vance carried. But that doesn't explain everything, Orlando interjected, his voice betraying a growing nervousness. The documents that Jimmy kept, they're not just about my embezzlement, are they? No, Jimmy confirmed, standing up. They also prove that you knew the accident wasn't accidental, that there was a second car that night, one that you hired to ensure that Theodore never made it to the meeting. Orlando's face lost all color. You can't prove... I can, Deborah interrupted him, holding up a specific folder from the documents. It's all here. Payment records, coded communications. You didn't just plan an accident, you planned a murder. And while you were plotting, Jimmy continued, his voice laden with 2 decades of guilt and determination, I spent 22 years building evidence, recovering every embezzled penny, preparing for the moment when I could do the only right thing, return everything to the Vance family. No! Orlando lunged towards the folder Deborah was holding, but Olegario was faster. With surprising agility for his age, he blocked the former partner's path. Enough, he declared with the authority that only a true Vance could have. Enough violence, enough lies. At that moment, Isis disengaged herself from her mother's lap and walked to Jimmy. Her little fingers found the hand of the man that everyone now knew wasn't who he claimed to be, but who had spent 2 decades trying to fix a mistake that wasn't his. You're the golden angel from my dreams, she said simply. The child's innocent statement seemed to undo something in the tense atmosphere. Valentina began to cry silently. Olegario leaned heavily in a chair, and Esther, who had spent the last few years building a career based on appearances, felt her own defenses crumble. So what happens now? She asked, to no one in particular. Now, Anastasia replied, her voice carrying the weight of someone who had kept secrets for too long. Now it's time for the truth to finally set us free. But as the sun began to rise over Phoenix, no one in the room could predict how that liberation would affect each of their lives or the even deeper secrets that were about to emerge. The morning sun lazily filtered through the slats of the Vance mansion's curtains, illuminating exhausted faces after a night of revelations. Regina, the cook, circulated silently, serving strong coffee to everyone, while Dr. Michael organized his notes on Isis's rare condition. The girl had fallen asleep again in Valentina's arms, who did not take her eyes off her daughter, as if fearing that she might disappear at any moment. Deborah remained isolated in a corner of the room, the documents spread methodically over a side table. Her hands trembled slightly as she organized the evidence into distinct piles, one for Orlando's crimes, another for the documentation of Theodore's true identity, and a third, thinner one, which she purposefully kept out of reach of the other's eyes. "There's something that still doesn't make sense," Esther broke the silence, her voice hoarse after hours of discussion. She had positioned herself strategically between her father, Jimmy, and the door, as if she still hadn't decided whether to stay or flee. Why the Monroes? How did Valentina end up leaving Isis with them? Valentina looked up, tired and red-eyed from crying so much. "I didn't have a choice. Orlando—" "I cornered her," Orlando interrupted, surprising everyone with his sudden honesty. He was sitting in a chair near the window, under Olegario's watchful gaze. "After I found out who she was, through some contacts at the adoption registry, I realized I could use it against Jimmy, but I needed to keep her under control." "So you blackmailed her into giving up her own daughter?" Anastasia asked, her voice filled with contempt. "The Monroes owed a lot of money to loan sharks," Orlando explained, running a hand over his tired face. "I paid off their debts in exchange for a favor, keeping Isis in their care and informing me about anyone who showed special interest in the girl. And when I showed up collecting the overdue rent," Jimmy began. "They contacted me immediately," Orlando completed. "But you were faster, taking the girl before I could intervene." But why?" Esther insisted, taking a step towards Orlando. "Why so much effort to keep Valentina and Isis apart? What did you really want?" It was Deborah who answered, holding up the third pile of documents she had kept separate. "Because this isn't just about Theodore's identity or the embezzlement. It's about the true structure of Vance Enterprises." Olegario stood up abruptly. "What are you talking about?" "Your brother, the real Theodore," Deborah continued, "had discovered something much bigger than Orlando's embezzlement. He discovered that Vance Enterprises was built with dirty money decades ago by your father." The silence that followed was deafening. Olegario staggered, needing to lean against the wall. "Impossible. Our father was an honest man." "Was he?" "Really?" Orlando laughed humorlessly. "Why do you think I had so much power within the company? Your father put me there to continue the scheme. Theodore found out and threatened to expose everything. It wasn't just about my embezzlement. It was about the entire structure of the company," Jimmy completed, finally understanding. "That's why you needed to keep me under control all these years. It wasn't just to hide your crimes, but to keep the whole scheme running." Dr. Michael, who had been observing everything in silence while monitoring Isis, cleared his throat to attract attention. "This may explain the intensity of the girl's dreams. In cases of traumatic genetic memory, the trauma doesn't have to be just physical. Deep emotional traumas, especially involving family matters, can be passed down through generations." "What do you mean?" Valentina asked, instinctively holding Isis tighter in her arms. "Her dreams aren't just about the accident," the doctor explained. "They're about all the emotional baggage involved, The family secrets, the lies, the guilt. It's as if the very DNA of the Vances carries the weight of decades of deception. At that moment, Isis stirred in her mother's lap, her eyes opening, slowly. "Mommy," she murmured, "I dreamed about Grandpa." Everyone froze. Olegario took a step towards his granddaughter, his voice trembling. "What Grandpa, little one?" "The sad Grandpa," she replied, rubbing her eyes. "He was crying in the office, tearing up papers. There was a safe behind the painting, just like here." Jimmy exchanged a meaningful look with Olegario. "The office at the old company headquarters," he said, "where your father worked." "It's impossible for her to know that," Olegario murmured. "That office was closed more than 30 years ago. Unless—" Dr. Michael leaned forward, his eyes shining with scientific interest. "Unless her genetic memory is accessing not only the trauma of the accident, but all the significant traumatic memories of the Vance lineage." "The safe is still there," Orlando said suddenly. Everyone turned to him. "At the old headquarters. It was never opened after the old man Vance. After he passed, Theodore had the combination, but he was gone before he could use it," Jimmy completed. "And you kept the office intact all these years because whatever is in that safe," Deborah interrupted, "can prove all these suspicions about the origin of Vance Enterprises." Esther, who had remained silent, absorbing all the information, finally spoke. "So that's why you came back from Paris," she said, turning to her mother. "You didn't rush back to support me after the scandal. You already knew all this." Deborah had the decency to look embarrassed. "I had been investigating for years, daughter. When I heard about your problem in Paris, I realized it was the perfect opportunity to return and access the documents I needed." "Using your own daughter as an excuse," Anastasia commented with disgust. "And I wasn't the only one," Deborah retorted, giving Orlando a meaningful look. "Why do you think he was so interested in Valentina and Isis? It's one thing to blackmail Jimmy about the false identity, another is all this effort to keep mother and daughter apart. Because as long as Valentina was vulnerable, Jimmy understood, you could use Isis as a bargaining chip. Not to expose me, but to ensure that I never investigated too deeply the origins of the company. And now we have a 6-year-old child," Dr. Michael added, "who through a very rare neurological condition may be accessing memories that would reveal the whole truth." As if to confirm his words, Isis sat up straight in Valentina's lap. Her eyes focused on something only she could see. "Grandpa is putting the papers in the safe," she murmured. "The combination. He's using the combination." Olegario knelt in front of his granddaughter, his hands trembling. "What numbers are you seeing, little one?" 7, 4, 9, she continued, her voice distant. 3, 1, 6. Orlando had paled completely. "It's the date," he whispered. "The date he opened the first store." "We need to go there," Jimmy decided, standing up. "Now." "No," Orlando interjected. "You don't understand. If this truth comes to light, it won't just be the end of Vance Enterprises. It will be the end of everything that has been built in the last 50 years in Phoenix. The jobs, the families that depend." "Enough lies," Olegario cut him off. "Enough secrets. My granddaughter is carrying the weight of decades of family trauma. This ends today." As the group prepared to leave for the old company headquarters, no one noticed Deborah discreetly sending a text message. Outside the mansion, a man in a black car received the message and smiled. Ricky Monroe, older brother of Jefferson, a former detective suspended for corruption, started the engine. He had his own reasons for being interested in the contents of that safe. The truth about Vance Enterprises was about to come to light, but the price of that revelation could be higher than any of them imagined. The old Vance Enterprises building stood like a concrete ghost in the historic downtown of Phoenix. Its Dusty windows reflected the morning sun as three cars parked in front of the abandoned building. From the first, Jimmy, Esther, and Anastasia got out. From the second, Olegario, Valentina with Isis in her lap, and Dr. Michael, who had insisted on accompanying the group to monitor the girl's condition. From the third, Orlando and Deborah under everyone's watchful gaze. "Does access to the top floor still work?" Jimmy asked Orlando, who held a bunch of old keys. "The service staircase," Orlando replied, his voice tense. "The elevator was deactivated years ago." As they climbed the 6 flights of stairs, Isis became increasingly agitated in her mother's lap. Her eyes scanned the peeling walls as if seeing beyond time, recognizing details that shouldn't exist in her memories. The painting was there. She pointed to a lighter patch on the hallway wall of the top floor. The one of the serious man, with the rose on his lapel. Olegario stopped abruptly. "The portrait of our father," he murmured. "How can she know?" "The memories are getting stronger," Dr. Michael observed, checking Isis's pulse. "Proximity to the location must be intensifying." The phenomenon. The main office still retained vestiges of its former grandeur. Furniture covered with dusty sheets, heavy curtains partially blocking the light, and the characteristic smell of old paper and wood. Jimmy walked directly to the wall where a painting had been removed, revealing the safe mentioned by Isis. "The numbers, little one." Olegario knelt beside his granddaughter. "Can you see again?" Isis closed her eyes, her small forehead furrowed in concentration. 7, 4, 9, 3, 1, 6. Jimmy spun the dial of the safe, each number echoing in the tense silence of the room. With a metallic click, the heavy door opened. Inside, a single folder yellowed with time. "No!" Orlando lunged. He forward, but Anastasia was faster. The housekeeper, who had always seemed so restrained, surprised everyone by immobilizing Orlando with a precise technique. 15 years working security at the bank before coming to the Vances, she explained, before the astonished looks. "I learned a few things." Jimmy removed the folder from the safe with trembling hands. When he opened it, his eyebrows rose in surprise. "They're letters," he said, flipping through the old papers. "From who?" Deborah tried to approach, but Esther blocked her path. "From my mother," Olegario replied, recognizing the handwriting. "Amelia Vance." "But she left when you were children," Orlando protested, still immobilized by Anastasia. "The old man Vance always said she abandoned you." "It wasn't quite like that." Isis spoke suddenly, her voice different, older somehow. "Grandma Amelia found out everything." Everyone turned to the girl. Valentina could feel her daughter's heart racing against her chest. "Dr. Michael," she called, concerned. "It's normal," the doctor assured, though his own tone betrayed fascination. "In extreme cases of genetic memory, the individual can access not only memories, but also sensations and even ancestral personalities." "She found out about the money," Isis continued, her eyes fixed on a distant point, "about how great-grandpa started the company." Jimmy began to read one of the letters aloud. "My beloved Ricardo, I can no longer pretend that I don't know the truth. The money to start the stores. You didn't get through bank loans as you always said. I found the documents, the evidence of what really happened to the Ribeiro family and their farm. How could you? They trusted you, Ricardo, and you used the drought, their hardship, to take everything. You forged documents, bribed authorities, destroyed lives. I cannot be complicit in this. I cannot allow our children, Theodore and Olegario, to grow up believing that fortune and power are more important than integrity. I'm leaving, but not by choice. Your threats were clear. If I try to tell the truth, you will use your power and influence to destroy me. So I will leave in silence, carrying this secret. But know that one day the truth will come to light." The blood of the Ribeiros still runs in Phoenix, and the past has a way of catching up with the present, with sadness. Amelia. The silence that followed was broken by a bitter laugh from Orlando. "So that was it," he said. "That's why the old Vance put me in the company, even though I was so young. I was the only one who knew the whole truth, who helped hide the last documents that could prove what he did to the Ribeiros. And you used that knowledge to stay in power," Jimmy completed, "even after I assumed Theodore's identity." "The Ribeiros," Valentina murmured, a distant memory surfacing. "My adoptive parents. They always talked about that name. They said they had a debt of gratitude to that family, because it was the Ribeiros who saved your biological parents during the drought." Olegario understood, tears streaming down his aging face. "And our father destroyed those people for greed." At that moment, a noise in the hallway made everyone turn around. Ricky Monroe, former detective and Jefferson's brother, entered the room with a gun in his hand. "Nobody move," he ordered. "Deborah told me everything, about the documents, about the safe." "Deborah?" Esther turned to her mother, horrified. "I needed insurance," Deborah replied, lifting her chin defiantly. "I always knew there was something rotten in the origin of the Vance fortune. When I found out about Ricky, about how he was removed from the police force for investigating too deeply certain powerful families—" "You don't understand," Ricky interrupted, his voice trembling with emotion. "The Ribeiros were my mother's in family. I spent years trying to prove what Ricardo Vance did to them. It was then that something extraordinary happened. Isis, who had been watching everything with wide eyes, began to speak in a voice that wasn't hers. Ricky, my grandson." Everyone froze. It was the voice of an elderly woman, laden with a rural accent. "Grandma Maria." Ricky lowered the gun, shocked. "This is not how justice is done," the voice continued through Isis. "Ricardo Vance has already paid his price, and his greed brought consequences that not even he could foresee." "What do you mean?" Olegario asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "The accident," the voice replied. "It wasn't a coincidence. The car that hit you that night was driven by the last of the Ribeiros, consumed by revenge. But he didn't know that in the other car was the chance for redemption. Valentina," Jimmy understood. "The baby I saved." "The granddaughter of Maria Ribeiro," the voice confirmed. "Destiny has mysterious ways of correcting the injustices of the past." Isis blinked several times, returning to herself. Dr. Michael immediately began to examine her while everyone processed the extraordinary revelation. "So," Valentina tried to organize her thoughts, "my biological parents were Olga and Olegario Vance," Jimmy completed gently, and your adoptive parents were relatives of the Ribeiros, the family that your biological grandfather destroyed. And now," Anastasia added, still holding Orlando firmly, "your daughter carries the memories of all these generations, the pain of the Ribeiros, the remorse of the Vances, the secrets of all of us," Esther concluded, looking at those present. Her father who wasn't her father, her mother who conspired in the shadows, her uncle who had just discovered that his long-lost niece was alive, and a little girl who carried the weight of decades of lies in her dreams. Outside, the Phoenix sun continued its journey across the sky, indifferent to the secrets that had just come to light in the old office. But inside that room, nothing would ever be the same. The past, present, and future of the Vance and Ribeiro families were inextricably intertwined, and only time would tell how this story would end. The afternoon heat began to intensify in Phoenix as the group left the old Vance Enterprises building. The revelations of the last few hours weighed on everyone like a thick blanket, each lost in their own reflections on how decades of secrets had finally converged at that moment. In the car, leading the convoy back to the mansion, Jimmy drove in silence, occasionally glancing in the rearview mirror at Esther, who occupied the back seat. His daughter, not by blood, but by 2 decades of love and dedication, kept her eyes fixed on the passing landscape, her expression as unreadable as those she used to wear on the runways of Paris. "Did you always know?" she asked finally, her voice breaking the tense silence. "That one day all this would come to light?" "Not in the way it happened," Jimmy replied honestly. "But yes, I always knew that the truth would find its way. That's why you were so distant sometimes?" Esther continued, years of doubts finally finding a voice. "Because you knew that one day you would lose all this? Lose us?" In the passenger seat, Anastasia swallowed hard, remembering all the times she had witnessed Jimmy watching Esther grow up, his genuine love always tempered by a melancholy that now made sense. "No," Jimmy replied, his voice choked with emotion. "It was because every moment of happiness with you and your mother came with the guilt for Olivia, my first daughter, for Valentina, who grew up without knowing her true identity, for all who were affected by this web of lies that started long before me." In the second car, Valentina held sleeping Isis, while Dr. Michael monitored the girl's vital signs. Olegario, sitting at the wheel, couldn't stop looking at the daughter he thought he had lost so long ago. "She has Olga's eyes," he commented, softly. "I always had the feeling that I knew those eyes from somewhere." Valentina stroked Isis's hair. "In my dreams, in the few I could remember, there was always a woman singing, a lullaby." "Hush, little baby," Olegario completed, his voice trembling. "It was Olga's favorite. She sang it every night during the pregnancy." In the passenger seat, Dr. Michael made frantic notes. "It's fascinating," he murmured. "Genetic memory is not only manifested in traumas, but also in memories of love and comfort. Isis is not only reliving the tragedy, but the entire history of her origins." In the third car, the silence was even heavier. Orlando drove under the watchful gaze of Ricky Monroe, who had decided to accompany them after handing his gun over to Anastasia. Deborah, in the back seat, maintained her characteristic rigid posture, although her eyes betrayed the turmoil of emotions she was trying to contain. "Do you really believe," Ricky broke the silence, "that keeping these secrets for so long was worth it?" Orlando laughed bitterly. "You don't understand. It wasn't just about power or money. It was about an entire city built on lies. Vance Enterprises aren't just stores. They are the backbone of Phoenix's economy. And that justifies what you did to my family?" Ricky retorted. "No!" Orlando surprised everyone with his honesty. "Nothing justifies it. But we also cannot ignore that thousands of people depend on these companies today. Entire families." "How ironic," Deborah interjected, her voice laden with sarcasm. "The man who helped destroy one family is now concerned about the welfare of others. And you?" Ricky turned to face her. "Why did you really look for me? It wasn't for justice." Deborah sustained his gaze. "When I discovered the truth about Jimmy, about who he really was, I realized that my entire marriage, my entire life was based on lies. I needed something concrete, something that would give me bargaining power when everything came to light." When the 3 cars finally arrived at the Vance mansion, they found a surprise waiting for them. Standing at the main gate was a woman of about 40, her dark hair streaked with grey, revealing a striking resemblance to Jimmy. "Olivia," he whispered, immediately recognizing his biological daughter, whom he hadn't seen in more than 2 decades. "Hi, Dad," she replied simply. "Or should I say Jimmy?" The entire group froze. Olivia took a step forward, her eyes scanning each face present until they landed on Esther. "So, you're my sister," she said, "at least by upbringing." Esther felt her legs weaken, Anastasia quickly supported her while Jimmy tried to find words. "How?" was all he could say. "I received a letter," Olivia explained. "Anonymous. Telling the whole story about how my father had assumed the identity of a businessman after an accident. I didn't believe it, of course, until I started investigating and all the pieces fell into place." Deborah paled visibly. The anonymous letter had been her last card, sent weeks before, when she began to realize that she would need more allies to face what was to come. At that moment, Isis woke up in Valentina's arms, her eyes, still sleepy, immediately fixed on Olivia. "You have nightmares too," the girl said, her voice carrying that strange maturity that appeared when she accessed ancestral memories. "About your father disappearing on a stormy night." Olivia staggered as if she had been slapped. "How do you—" "It's a long story," Dr. Michael intervened gently. "A story about how the past never really leaves us, about how the secrets and traumas of a family can echo through generations. And about how sometimes," Olegario added, looking meaningfully, "at Valentina, destiny finds unexpected ways to reunite people who should never have been separated." As the group entered the mansion, no one noticed the car that was slowly passing by on the street. Inside it, Jefferson Monroe watched the scene with interest. His phone vibrated with a message from his brother Ricky. "It's all connected. The Vances, the Ribeiros, everything. We need to talk." Night began to fall over Phoenix, but the secrets that had been revealed that day were far from over. In the mansion's library, Anastasia discreetly organized Amelia Vance's letters, finding among them an envelope still sealed, addressed to "My grandchildren, when the truth comes to light." And in the master bedroom, Isis fell asleep again. Her dreams now populated not only by memories of tragedy and loss, but also of redemption and reunion. In her sleep, she smiled, as if finally the pieces of an ancestral puzzle were beginning to fit together. The library of the Vance mansion, with its floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves, had transformed into a kind of makeshift headquarters. The air conditioning fought against the sweltering Phoenix heat, while documents, photos, and old letters covered the large central table. Anastasia had just found the mysterious envelope addressed to Amelia's grandchildren, and now all those present waited in tense silence as Olegario, with trembling hands, prepared to open it. Olivia was sitting between Esther and Valentina, the three women united by bonds that none of them fully understood yet. Jimmy remained standing near the window, his rigid posture betraying the emotional storm he faced as he saw his two daughters, one by blood, the other by upbringing, finally reunited. Dr. Michael continued making notes in his notebook, occasionally casting fascinated glances at Isis, who slept peacefully on a nearby sofa, wrapped in an old blanket that Anastasia had found. "Before we open it," Olivia broke the silence, "I think I deserve to know the whole truth, not just about my father, but about everything." "She's right," Esther agreed, surprising everyone. "If we're going to expose family's secrets, let them all be exposed." Orlando, who remained under Ricky's discreet watch, let out a bitter laugh. "You have no idea what you're asking. Some truths are too heavy. Like the fact that the accident that killed my parents wasn't really an accident," Valentina asked, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone. "Or how the Vance Empire was built on the destruction of the Ribeiro family." "Or perhaps," Deborah added, her sarcastic tone barely disguising the bitterness, "about how some of us always knew the truth, but chose silence in exchange for privileges." "Enough!" Anastasia's voice cut through the air like a razor. The housekeeper, who had always remained in the shadows, now stepped to the center of the room. "I have served this family for longer than anyone here. I have seen 3 generations of secrets accumulate like dust in the corners of this mansion. And now, thanks to a 6-year-old child with an extraordinary gift, everything is coming to light. So let's do this right. She turned to Jimmy. Start from the beginning, not the story that everyone knows, but the real one. Jimmy took a deep breath, his eyes meeting Olivia's before he began. I was a different man before I became Theodore Vance. Jimmy Silver, son of Matilda, grew up watching my mother work as a maid in family homes. I studied at night, got a job as a bank security guard, and that's where I met the real Theodore. And Orlando, Ricky completed, who was already embezzling money from the company. Yes, Jimmy confirmed. I discovered the irregularities by chance. When I confronted Orlando, he offered me a part of the scheme. I refused and decided to tell Theodore everything. But there was more, Orlando interrupted, surprising everyone with his sudden honesty. Much more. What Jimmy discovered wasn't just about my embezzlement. It was about how Ricardo, Vance, Theodore, and Oligario's father, had built his empire. Using the drought that devastated the region in the 70s, Ricky continued, his voice bitter, when the Ribeiro family, my maternal ancestors, lost everything. It was then that Isis stirred on the sofa, her eyes opening suddenly. But it wasn't the eyes of a 6-year-old child that observed the room. There was in them an ancient wisdom, a memory that transcended generations. Ricardo didn't act alone, she spoke, her voice carrying the characteristic accent of the deep countryside. Amelia found out everything, the falsified deeds, the forced loans, the threats. Grandma Maria, Ricky whispered, recognizing again the voice of his maternal grandmother speaking through Isis. Yes, my grandson, the voice replied, but there is more, much more. Ricardo didn't know, but in destroying our family, he wove a destiny that would come back to haunt him through the generations. Dr. Michael had stopped writing, completely absorbed in the phenomenon he was witnessing. The memories, they are manifesting more strongly now, as if all the generations were present in this room. The accident, the voice of Isis, Maria, continued. It wasn't just revenge. It was fate correcting its own paths. The last of the Ribeiros, consumed by the desire for justice, caused the tragedy that would lead his own great-granddaughter, Valentina, into the arms of the Vances. Oligario, who still held the sealed envelope, felt his hands tremble even more. "Mother," he murmured, "did you know all this?" As if in response, the voice coming from Isis changed subtly, assuming the educated and restrained tones of Amelia Vance. "I knew, my son. And that's why I left these letters, because I knew that one day when the truth came to light, you would need to understand not only what happened, but why." On an impulse, Oligario finally opened the envelope. Inside, there was not only a letter, but also an old photograph. In it, a young Amelia Vance stood next to Maria Ribeiro, the two smiling at the camera. "We were friends," the voice of Amelia explained through Isis, "before Ricardo, before money and power changed everything. When I discovered what he had done to her family, I tried to fix things in secret, but Ricardo found out and threatened. You," Olivia completed, understanding, "that's why you disappeared. But not before ensuring that the truth would be preserved," the voice continued. "These letters, the documents in the safe, everything was left so that one day, when the right moment arrived, justice could be done." And at this moment, Isis blinked several times, returning to being just a 6-year-old girl. Valentina ran to hug her, while Dr. Michael quickly checked her vital signs. "She's fine," the doctor assured. "But what we have just witnessed is extraordinary." As if the very DNA of the families was trying to tell its story through her. Jimmy approached Olivia, his eyes pleading for understanding. "When I assumed Theodore's identity, it wasn't just to escape. It was because I saw a chance to fix things, to use the power of the Vances to do good. But in the process, I lost you and gained Esther, Olivia completed, looking at her half-sister. How ironic. No, Esther interjected, he didn't gain me to replace you, just as he isn't helping Isis and Valentina to compensate for the past. Some things are simply bigger than our individual choices. Deborah, who had remained strangely silent, finally spoke. The documents I stole from the safe weren't just about Orlando's crimes or Jimmy's false identity. They were about a secret fund created by Amelia before she left. What fund? Orlando asked sharply. A multi-million-dollar fund, Deborah revealed, destined for the descendants of the Ribeiros, as if Amelia knew that one day the families would meet again. The silence that followed was broken by the sound of footsteps in the hallway. Jefferson Monroe entered the library, his normally arrogant face marked by an expression of defeat. It's over, he announced. The FBI is on its way. Someone turned everything in. All eyes turned to Ricky, who shook his head. It wasn't me. It was me. A new voice sounded from the doorway. Regina, the cook who had always seemed so discreet, stepped forward with firm steps. Or rather, I, Regina Ribeiro da Silva, great-granddaughter of Maria Ribeiro and second cousin of Valentina. The revelation fell like a bomb in the room, already overloaded with surprises. Outside, the sun began to set over Phoenix, painting the sky with shades of red, reminiscent of the fire that, 2 decades ago, had changed the fate of so many families. And on the sofa, Isis smiled in her sleep, as if finally the voices of the past that inhabited her dreams had found the peace they had sought for so long. Twilight tinged the windows of the Vance mansion with orange tones as the first FBI vehicles began to arrive. Regina, now revealed as Regina Ribeiro da Silva, remained standing, her posture demonstrating a dignity that her role as a cook had never revealed before. The group in the library had instinctively reorganized. Valentina hugged Isis protectively. Jimmy stood beside his 2 daughters, Olivia and Esther, while Olegario still held his mother's letters as if they were a talisman. "Did you always know?" Anastasia asked Regina, her voice betraying a mixture of admiration and understanding. "All these years." "Not at the beginning," Regina replied, her eyes scanning the faces that were watching her. "When I started working here, 15 years ago, I only knew the stories my grandmother told about the Vances. But then, over time, the pieces began to fall into place. That's why you always took such good care of Isis since she arrived," Valentina understood. "You knew who she was, who I was." "We're family," Regina confirmed with a soft smile. "Even if distantly, when you were little Valentina before the accident, our families were already connected in ways we never imagined." Dr. Michael, who had remained absorbed in his notes, raised his head abruptly. "Isis's dreams. They started to get more intense after she arrived at the mansion, didn't they? After she came into contact with you, Regina." "Yes," the cook confirmed. "I believe that my presence, also carrying the blood of the Ribeiros, has acted as a kind of catalyst for her genetic memories." The sound of firm footsteps in the hallway interrupted the conversation. An FBI agent, accompanied by 2 officers, entered the library. Her experienced gaze swept the room before fixing on Regina. "Regina Ribeiro da Silva?" the agent asked, although it was clearly a formality. "I'm Agent Beatriz Montero. Your documents and complaints were very well substantiated." "It's been decades of information gathering," Regina replied. "Not just mine, but from generations of our family." Orlando, who remained under Ricky's watch, let out a bitter laugh. "So this is how it ends? The entire Vance empire destroyed by a cook?" "No," Jimmy interjected, his voice surprisingly firm. "The Vance empire will not be destroyed. It will be transformed as it should have been long ago." He stood up, facing the agent with a dignity that impressed even those who despised him. "My real name is Jimmy Silver, and before your agents begin the arrests, I would like to present a proposal." Beatrice raised an eyebrow, interested. "What kind of proposal?" "One that Amelia Vance planned decades ago." Deborah surprised everyone by saying, taking more documents from her folder. The secret fund she created wasn't just money. It was a complete plan for restructuring the companies. Olegario began to read the letter he still held, his eyes widening as he absorbed his mother's words. "My dear children, when this letter reaches you, the empire built by your father will have finally found its moment of truth. The fund I created is not a simple compensation. It is a chance for a fresh start. Vance Enterprises must become a shared corporation, with ownership divided between the Vance and Ribeiro families, managed by a board that ensures that the mistakes of the past are never repeated. A 50-year plan," Regina added. "Amelia not only kept evidence and money, she created a complete structure for when the truth came to light." Agent Beatrice watched the scene with professional interest. "This doesn't change the crimes committed, both old and recent." "No," Jimmy agreed, "and I'm prepared to face the consequences of my actions. But first, I would like to ensure that the future Amelia planned can be realized." At this moment, Isis stirred in Valentina's lap, her eyes opening with that old expression that everyone had already learned to recognize. But this time, when she spoke, her voice was a harmonious blend of all the generations she carried in her DNA. "The circle needs to close," she said, "not with revenge or destruction, but with unity and reconstruction." Dr. Michael had stopped writing, completely mesmerized by the phenomenon he was witnessing. It's as if all the memories, all the generations, are finally finding a point of convergence in her. "The documents Regina gathered," Agent Beatrice continued, consulting a folder, "show a pattern of decades of corruption, but also a consistent effort on some parts to correct the mistakes of the past." "How so?" Esther asked, leaning forward. "Your mother, for example." Beatrice pointed to Deborah, who paled. "While participating in the irregularities, she also kept detailed records that would serve as evidence later. A kind of insurance, perhaps." "Or remorse," Deborah whispered, avoiding her daughter's gaze. "And you," the agent turned to Jimmy, "using Theodore Vance's identity, you not only kept the companies running, but you gradually implemented policies of social responsibility, especially in areas that benefited old families harmed by the Vances." "It wasn't enough," Jimmy admitted. "No," Regina agreed. "But it was a start. And now, with Amelia's plan—" "The plan can work," Olivia interjected suddenly. "I'm a corporate attorney. I can verify the legal structure, ensure that the transition is done properly. And I can help," Esther added, surprising everyone. "My experience in public relations. We can turn this into a case study of corporate reconciliation and social justice." Agent Beatrice watched the group for a long moment before speaking. "We will have to make arrests. Crimes have been committed, and justice needs to be done." "We understand," Ricky replied, finally releasing Orlando. "But perhaps, along with punishment, we can also have reparation." Orlando surprisingly nodded. "I'm too old to run, and maybe it's time to tell everything I know about Ricardo Vance, about the schemes, about how it all really began." At this moment, a distant thunder announced the approach of another storm in Phoenix. Isis, still in Valentina's lap, smiled serenely. "The storms always come back," she said, her voice again carrying echoes of past generations, "but this time not to destroy, to cleanse, to renew." Olegario approached his newly discovered daughter and granddaughter, silent tears streaming down his aging face. "Your grandmother Olga always said that storms were nature's way of starting over. Maybe she was right." Regina watched the scene with a mixture of sadness and hope. Decades of secrets, pain, and injustice were finally coming to light, but along with them, a possibility of redemption arose that not even Amelia Vance could have completely foreseen. Outside, the first raindrops began to fall on Phoenix, washing away the dust of decades of secrets. And inside the Vance mansion, two families, long separated by greed and fate, began to glimpse a future where old wounds could finally begin to heal. The storm that was falling over Phoenix seemed to wash not only the streets of the city, but also decades of secrets and lies. In the Vance mansion, the library had been transformed into a kind of makeshift headquarters where Agent Beatrice Montero coordinated her team in collecting and organizing documents, while Dr. Michael continued his observations on the extraordinary case of Isis. The girl was now sleeping peacefully on one of the library sofas, apparently exhausted after her manifestations of ancestral memories. Valentina remained beside her, occasionally sharing meaningful glances with Regina, her newfound cousin. The cook, now revealed as much more than that, methodically organized an impressive pile of evidence she had collected over the years. It started with small things, Regina explained to the agent, her calm voice masking years of patient dedication. Documents forgotten in drawers, conversations overheard during important dinners, patterns I began to notice in the accounting. Books when I helped clean the office. Decades of surveillance, Beatrice commented, impressed, while everyone only saw a cook. Everyone except me, Anastasia interrupted softly. I always knew there was something different about you, Regina. The way you watched everything. How you knew every corner of this house better than its own owners. Jimmy, who had remained near the window observing the rain, turned to face them. Did you know about me? About who I really was? From day one, Regina confirmed. The way you looked at the portrait of the real Theodore. There was guilt there, but also determination. And when I started investigating the company's financial records, I realized that after you took control, several old families from Phoenix, mainly descendants of the Ribeiros, began to receive contracts, opportunities. A silent attempt at reparation, Olivia understood, looking at the man who, despite his lies, continued to be her father. Even living a false identity, you were trying to fix things. It wasn't enough, Jimmy admitted. Nothing could be enough to compensate for what Ricardo Vance did to the Ribeiros, or what I did by assuming Theodore's identity. But no. But you tried, Esther completed, surprising everyone by defending the man she had just discovered wasn't her biological father. While others used their powers to continue the exploitation, you tried, even if inadequately, to do something. Right. Orlando, who was waiting in a corner under the watch of the federal agents, let out a bitter laugh. How touching, the virtuous imposter. But you forget that he also participated in the charade for years, that he kept secrets that destroyed lives. Like you're doing now? The voice of Isis sounded suddenly. The girl had woken up and was now sitting on the sofa, her eyes fixed on Orlando with a disturbing intensity. There's still something you haven't told, something about the night of the accident. The former executive paled visibly. Agent Beatrice immediately focused her attention on him, while Dr. Michael approached Isis, fascinated by yet another manifestation of her genetic memories. What is she talking about, Orlando? Ricky demanded. I don't, Orlando stammered, but Isis interrupted him, her voice now carrying the unmistakable timbre of Amelia Vance. You weren't just following Theodore that night. You had a plan that went terribly wrong. How can she know? Orlando whispered, collapsing into a chair. Because I saw, the voice of Amelia continued through Isis. I was there too, Orlando, following you who followed my son, wanting to prevent another tragedy, but arriving too late. The revelation fell like a lightning bolt in the already electrified room. Olegario staggered, needing to lean on a bookshelf. "Mother, hadn't you disappeared? I was never far away." The voice replied. "I kept myself in the shadows, observing, collecting evidence, preparing for the moment when the truth could come to light without destroying everything we built. And that night—" "Stop!" Orlando shouted, rising abruptly. "You can't prove anything." "I can," a new voice sounded from the library door. Everyone turned to see an elderly lady leaning on a cane, her bright eyes shining with decades of secrets about to be revealed. "Amelia," Olegario whispered, barely believing his eyes. The real Amelia Vance entered the library with slow but firm steps, her gaze scanning each face present before fixing on Orlando. "I kept the evidence all these years, Orlando. The photos I took that night, showing you not only following Theodore but coordinating with the driver who caused the accident." "Grandma!" Olivia approached hesitantly, tears streaming down her face. "My dear," Amelia smiled, touching her granddaughter's face. "You are so much like your mother." She then turned to Esther. "And you, my young woman, have the strength that I have always admired in the Vances, even not carrying our blood." How did you know it was time?" Regina asked, clearly impressed with the perfect timing of Amelia's appearance. "Because I never stopped watching," the lady replied. "When Regina started working here, I recognized in her the same spirit of justice that the Ribeiros always had. We kept in touch discreetly all these years, sharing information, preparing for this moment." Agent Beatrice approached, her face showing a deep respect for the lady. "Mrs. Amelia, your evidence will be essential for our case." "Yes," Amelia agreed. "But before, there's something you need to understand. What happens from now on can't be just about punishment. It needs to be about reconstruction." She walked to Isis, who was watching her with a serene smile, as if she had known her for a long time. "This child," Amelia continued, "carries in her blood both the pain and the hope of our families. Through her, the past has spoken to us, shown paths that we could not see before." "Her dreams," Dr. Michael intervened. "It's been more than genetic memories, hasn't it? It's been a way for the universe to balance old injustices." "Precisely," Amelia confirmed. "And now, with all the truths exposed, with all the masks off, we can finally implement the plan I've spent decades preparing." She retrieved an old folder from her bag, her eyes meeting Jimmy's. "Including about you, my dear. I always knew who you were, and I watched with interest as you tried to use the Vance power for good, even if imperfectly." "You approve of what I did?" Jimmy asked, astonished. "I don't approve of the lie," Amelia replied firmly, "but I understand the intentions, and now you'll have the chance to do things the right way." The storm outside began to subside, as if nature itself recognized that a cycle was completing. Isis, still sitting on the couch, smiled at Amelia with the look of someone sharing a deep secret. "The voices are calmer now," the girl said with her own voice, "as if they're satisfied." "Yes, little one," Amelia replied, her eyes glistening with contained tears. "Because finally, after so many years, the truth no longer needs to hide in the shadows of dreams. It can walk in the sunlight." And as night fell over Phoenix, the ancient Vance and Ribeiro families, for so long separated by lies and tragedies, began to glimpse a future where redemption and rebuilding were not only possible but inevitable. The early morning hours advanced over Phoenix, but no one in the Vance mansion thought of rest. Amelia's presence had completely transformed the dynamics of the investigations. Agent Beatrice had established a kind of improvised headquarters in the dining room, where piles of documents were methodically organized by her team. In the library, now illuminated only by a few lamps that created dancing shadows on the old bookshelves, a smaller group gathered to understand the deeper implications of everything that was being revealed. Amelia occupied a central armchair, like a queen on her throne, while Regina served tea to everyone in porcelain cups that she herself had kept stored for decades, a set that had belonged to the old matriarch of the Vances. "You were never just a cook, were you?" Anastasia asked Regina, a new respect in her voice. Regina smiled as she served another cup. "Just as you were never just a housekeeper, Anastasia. We were both Mrs. Monroe's eyes and ears all these years. We needed trusted people in strategic positions," Amelia explained, her lively eyes scanning the faces around her. "People who could observe without being noticed, who could access information without raising suspicions. Like a private intelligence network," Esther commented, impressed. "You built a surveillance system within the family itself." "It was necessary," Amelia replied with a sigh. "After I discovered what Ricky had done to the Ribeiro, I realized that simple complaints would not be enough. The system he had created was much more complex, much more rooted in the very structure of Phoenix." At this moment, Isis, who was sitting on Valentina's lap, raised her head as if she heard something that the others could not perceive. Dr. Michael immediately took out his notebook, preparing for another manifestation of ancestral memories. "The roots go far beyond the surface," the girl said, her voice again carrying that tone of ancient wisdom. "Like the old growth trees that seem small above but have roots that reach the center of the earth." Maria Ribeiro. Ricky recognized the characteristic metaphor of his grandmother. She always used that comparison. "Yes," Amelia agreed. "Maria and I discovered together the true extent of Ricky's schemes. It wasn't just about the Ribeiro's land. It was about how he had manipulated the entire economic structure of Phoenix for his benefit. The inflated contracts with the city government," Orlando interjected unexpectedly. Still in custody, he had been brought to the meeting at Amelia's request. The directed tenders, the forced loans. "And you continued with all of this after he left," Amelia accused him, although her tone was more of sadness than anger. "You transformed an already corrupt system into something even more perverse." "I had no choice," Orlando tried to defend himself. "The power that Ricky built, it was like a snowball. If it stopped, it would destroy everything. There's always—" "A choice," Jimmy interjected, his voice loaded with an authority that surprised everyone. "I chose to use Theodore's identity to try to fix things, even if imperfectly. You chose to perpetuate evil." "And now," Olivia added, "we all have to choose again. How to rebuild without destroying everything that was built." Amelia smiled, taking more documents from her folder. "That's why I've spent 50 years preparing for this moment. The plan isn't just about exposing the truth. It's about transformation." She began to explain, unrolling architectural plans and old projects. The Vance companies cannot simply be dismantled. Thousands of families depend on them, but they can be transformed. "The fund that you created," Deborah understood, "it's not just money for compensation. It's a new business model," Amelia completed, "based on shared ownership, transparent management, and real social responsibility, not just marketing." At this moment, Agent Beatrice entered the library, carrying a thick folder. "Mrs. Monroe, we found something you need to see." They were old photos, apparently taken in secret over decades. They showed secret meetings, exchanges of briefcases, suspicious encounters. In several of them, Orlando appeared alongside important figures from the city. "The network is even bigger than we imagined," Beatrice commented. "We have politicians, businessmen, judges—" "No," Amelia interrupted her gently. "The network is exactly the size I knew it was. That's why the transformation needs to be gradual, controlled." She stood up, walking to the window where the first rays of the sun were beginning to appear. "If we simply expose everything at once, all of Phoenix will collapse. We need to be surgeons, not executioners." "How?" Valentina asked, unconsciously holding Isis tighter in her arms. It was Regina who answered. The plan has 3 phases. First, the restructuring of the Vance companies, transforming them into a corporation with shared ownership between the affected families. Second, a social development program focused on the areas and families most harmed over the years. And third, the true transformation, Isis completed, her voice again carrying echoes of past generations, the healing of old wounds through the new generations. Dr. Michael, who had remained silent observing everything, finally spoke. It's extraordinary. Her gift. It's not just about memories of the past. It's as if she were a channel for ancestral wisdom itself, showing paths to healing. That's why the dreams started when she arrived at the mansion. Anastasia understood. It wasn't just about revealing secrets. It was about completing a cycle. Amelia nodded, returning to her seat. When I learned that Valentina had given birth to a girl with the Vance birthmark, I knew the moment was approaching. When Jimmy brought her to the mansion, all the pieces finally aligned. But what about the legal consequences? Esther asked, her practical side emerging. Crimes were committed. Yes, Agent Beatrice confirmed. There will be trials, arrests, and it's right that there should be, Amelia agreed. But justice doesn't have to mean total destruction. The plan I developed includes cooperation with the authorities, strategic plea bargains, leniency agreements. You've thought of everything, Jimmy commented, admired. 50 years gives a lot of time. To plan, Amelia smiled, and to learn that justice without wisdom is just revenge in disguise. The sun now completely illuminated the library, making the dust dance in the air like particles of gold. Isis had fallen asleep in Valentina's lap, a serene smile on her childish face. The ancestral voices that spoke through her seemed finally at peace. And now, Olivia asked, breaking the contemplative silence that had settled in. Now, Amelia replied, her gaze sweeping over each face present, we begin the real work. The exposure of the secrets was just the first step, the reconstruction. That will be our true journey. Outside the mansion, Phoenix was beginning to wake up to another day, unaware that its deepest foundations were about to undergo a transformation decades in the making. And at the center of it all, a little girl whose dreams had served as a bridge between the past and the future, between pain and hope, between justice and redemption. 6 months had passed since the night of the great revelations in the Vance mansion. Phoenix had changed, not abruptly and catastrophically as many feared, but gradually, like an old wound, finally receiving the proper treatment to heal. The old Vance mansion, once a symbol of power and secrets, had been transformed into a cultural and educational center, its doors now open to the community. In the old office where so many secrets were kept, a permanent exhibition told the true story of the Vance and Ribeiro families, not as a saga of villains and victims, but as a testimony to human complexity and the possibility of redemption. That spring morning, Isis played in the newly renovated garden, her laughter echoing among the rose bushes that Deborah used to keep. The girl, now almost 7 years old, seemed lighter, as if the weight of the ancestral memories she carried had found its purpose and balance. The dreams have changed, she explained to Dr. Michael, who continued his research on her extraordinary case of genetic memory. Now, they're no longer scary. They're like stories that the old voices want to tell. The doctor smiled, making his notes. His article on the phenomenon was revolutionizing the field of genetic research, although he had been careful to protect the identity of Isis and her family. And what do the voices tell now? He asked gently. Stories of hope, Isis replied with a wisdom that continued to surprise everyone. Grandma Monroe says that's how it should be. The past teaching us to build a better future. On the porch, Valentina watched her daughter with teary eyes. Beside her, Olegario, now officially recognized as her biological father, held her, and with the affection of someone trying to compensate for decades of forced separation. "She's extraordinary," Olegario commented. "So is her mother." Valentina smiled, still adapting to the idea of being the daughter of a Vance. Her life had changed dramatically in recent months, not only by the discovery of her origins, but by the central role she now played in the new structure of the companies. Amelia's plan had worked with almost prophetic precision. The transformation of the Vance companies into a corporation with shared ownership between the Vance and Ribeiro families was almost complete. Olivia, with her experience in corporate law, had been fundamental in the legal structuring of the transition. "More visitors today?" Anastasia asked, bringing a tray of lemonade to the porch. The former housekeeper now coordinated the social programs of the cultural center, her loyalty and discretion finally being used openly for the common good. "Yes," Valentina confirmed. "The Historical Reparation Committee is coming to present the results of the first semester." The committee, chaired by Regina, who had emerged from her role as a cook to become one of the main articulators of the transformation, had identified and begun to compensate dozens of families affected by the old schemes of the Vance. In the garden, Esther joined Isis, helping the girl to make flower crowns. The ex-model had found a new purpose as a spokesperson for the transformation project, using her experience in public relations to tell the story not as a scandal, but as a process of community healing. "Aunt Esther," Isis called, "tell me again. The story of the golden badge?" Esther smiled, sitting on the grass next to the girl. The story of how Jimmy had saved Valentina as a baby from the accident, even without knowing her true identity, had become a kind of parable about how small acts of kindness could change the course of history. It was a stormy night. Esther began, noting how other children who were visiting the cultural center approached to listen, and a man with a golden badge had to make a choice. In the library, now transformed into a meeting room, Jimmy, who had readopted his true name, worked with Amelia on the latest details of the business transition. After serving 3 months of house arrest and signing a broad agreement of collaboration with justice, he had dedicated himself entirely to the transformation project. "The numbers for the last quarter are promising," he commented, showing spreadsheets to Amelia. "Transparency in operations ended up attracting more investors than driving them away." "As I always knew it would," Amelia smiled, her eyes shining, with the satisfaction of seeing a decades-long plan finally coming to fruition. People respect the truth when it comes accompanied by concrete action. A movement at the door caught the attention of the two. It was Ricky Monroe, now responsible for the compliance department of the new corporation. Beside him, Orlando, who, after collaborating extensively with the investigations and serving part of his sentence, had been authorized to act as a consultant in the transition process under strict supervision. "The external auditors confirmed," Ricky announced. "All diverted assets have been tracked and are in the process of recovery." "And the old documents?" Amelia asked. "Catalogued and digitized," Orlando replied, his former arrogance replaced by a reflective sobriety. "Every suspicious transaction, every manipulation, everything will be used to prevent similar patterns from repeating themselves." In the garden, the sound of more cars arriving announced the beginning of another day of work at the cultural center. Deborah, who after a period of forced reflection had found a new purpose coordinating educational projects, welcomed a group of university students interested in studying the business transformation process. "The story you will learn about today," she began her presentation, "is not just about rights and wrongs, but about how a community can choose to face its past, to build a different future." Isis, still playing with her flowers, raised her head as if she heard something. Her smile widened as she recognized the voices that were now her constant companions, no longer frightening presences, but gentle guides connecting past and present. "They're happy," she said to Dr. Michael. "All the voices, Grandma Monroe, Grandma Maria, all of them. They say they can finally rest." The doctor made another note in his notebook. "Remarkable evolution. Genetic memories now seem to function as a form of validation of the collective healing process." In the late afternoon, as the sun began to set over Phoenix, the whole family gathered in the garden for a barbecue, a tradition that Regina had instituted to keep everyone connected despite the changes. Valentina watched her daughter running among the adults, distributing her flower crowns, and felt a peace she had never imagined possible. "It's strange," she commented to Olivia, who had become a sister to her in recent months, "how something that started with so much suffering could turn into so much hope." "Maybe that's the real miracle," Olivia replied, watching her father. "Jimmy, teach Isis how to make paper airplanes. Not her gift of carrying old memories, but her ability to transform them into something new." Amelia, sitting in her favorite chair in the garden, watched the scene with silent tears of joy. 50 years of waiting, of meticulous planning, of contained pain, finally bearing fruit that she had barely dared to dream of. "The old-growth trees," she murmured, quoting her old friend Maria Ribeiro's favorite metaphor, "sometimes need fire, so that new seeds can sprout." And as the night fell softly over Phoenix, the lights of the cultural center turned on, illuminating not only the garden where a reconciled family celebrated, but also casting light on a city that was learning that facing the truth, however painful, was the first step towards true transformation. Isis, tired of playing, snuggled in her mother's lap. Her eyes, already heavy with sleep, revealed that ancient wisdom that now seemed perfectly natural in her. "You know, Mom," she murmured, "the voices say that sometimes we need to get lost in order to truly find ourselves." Valentina kissed her daughter's forehead, understanding that through her, in some mysterious and beautiful way, generations of pain had been transformed into a future of hope. And as her daughter fell asleep, the stars began to dot the Phoenix sky, silent witnesses of how love, truth, and courage could finally heal even the oldest wounds.